A train slows into a small Texas town, carrying hundreds of captured German soldiers. This is World War II, and between 1942 and 1946, the United States shipped roughly 425,000 Axis prisoners across the Atlantic, the great majority of them German, some 372,000 men, and spread them through about 700 camps in nearly every state. It wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't mercy. These men picked cotton for 80 cents a day, and fewer than 1 man in 100 ever seriously tried to run. What they saw inside those camps, and what some of them chose to do years later, is a story no one finishes. The war made this decision before anyone in Washington did. For the first couple of years, the United States held almost no prisoners at all, because the fighting was an ocean away, and the enemy was somebody else's problem to capture. Then, in the spring of 1943, the German and Italian armies in North Africa collapsed, and 250,000 German and Italian troops walked into Allied captivity at once. Britain was the closest place to hold them, but Britain was short on food, short on space, and running out of room for its own people. The prisoners had to go somewhere, and the only country with the space, the food, and the ships to spare was 3,000 miles away across the water. The ships were the quiet part of the answer. American cargo vessels crossed the Atlantic packed with troops and supplies, unloaded in Europe, then turned around and sailed home nearly empty. Every one of those empty holds was a berth that cost the army almost nothing to fill. So the men who had been fighting under Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, a few weeks earlier, were marched up the gangways, sailed west across the same water the U-boats still hunted in, and unloaded at ports along the American coast. From the docks, they went inland by train, and that's where most Americans first laid eyes on them. The ships offloaded at New York, Boston, and Norfolk, the same East Coast ports that had shipped American troops out to Europe, and from there, the army scattered them across the country. Texas held more of them than anywhere else, partly for its open land and mild winters, and partly for the farms that would soon be desperate for the labor. Many of the camps went up fast on old army posts and abandoned work sites, and in some places, the prisoners built their own barracks after they arrived. Small towns that had never seen a foreign soldier stood along the tracks and watched trainloads of them roll in under guard. The rules for what came next were already written down. The Geneva Convention of 1929 spelled out how a prisoner of war had to be treated, and the United States chose to follow it closely, right down to the fine print. Enlisted men could be required to work. Officers couldn't be made to lift a finger, and they were housed apart and paid a small monthly allowance by rank. Everyone had to be sheltered, fed, and paid to a set standard, the same one the army used for its own soldiers of equal rank. And America followed that treaty partly in the cold hope that Germany would treat captured Americans the same way. That bargain was about to be tested, one camp at a time. Inside the gate at Camp Aliceville, Alabama, the first surprise is how ordinary everything looks. Rows of wooden barracks run in straight lines, with a mess hall, a canteen, and a soccer field worn into the dirt. The men sleep on cots with blankets, eat 3 meals a day, and draw the same ration the American army feeds its own troops. For soldiers who had spent months in the North African desert on short water and shorter food, this felt like the most comfortable they had been since the day they first put on the uniform. The days settled into a routine that looked almost nothing like war. There were roll calls in the morning, work details through the heat of the day, and long stretches of free time that the prisoners filled themselves. Camps grew orchestras out of Red Cross instruments, put on plays and concerts, printed their own little newspapers, and ran classes where prisoners taught one another everything from English to engineering. Some men enrolled in real correspondence courses and came home with credits. For a soldier of a losing army, the war had gone quiet, and the barbed wire started to feel less like a prison than a strange, waiting kind of pause. The food turned into a small scandal all on its own. American cooks served the prisoners meat, bread, vegetables, and real coffee, at a time when the civilians outside the fence were clipping ration coupons for those exact same things. Local families drove past the camps and wondered aloud, and sometimes in the newspapers, why enemy soldiers were eating better than the people who had sent their own sons off to fight. Inside the wire, the Germans put on weight, and word of the good treatment spread through the German ranks overseas as a reason to surrender to the Americans if the chance ever came. Then the army put them to work, because the Geneva Convention allowed it, and the country badly needed it. Millions of American men were overseas, and the farms they left behind were starving for hands to bring in the harvest. So the prisoners went into the fields. In Texas and across the South, they chopped the weeds out of young cotton with a hoe, bent under the same sun that had baked them in Africa, and came back later through the rows to pick it clean. Others canned vegetables, cut timber, dug potatoes, and stacked hay from dawn until the light gave out. And farmers who had feared the enemy came to depend on him by the season's end. The pay was 80 cents a day. Cash in enemy hands was asking for trouble, so the army paid them in canteen coupons they could spend at the camp store. 80 cents bought cigarettes, a bar of soap, a bottle of soda, the small comforts that made the days go by. A man who worked 6 days a week could stack up a small fortune in coupons by camp standards, and a few saved every one, while others gambled it all away by lamplight. The good years had an expiration date, and it arrived in the final months of the European War when Allied troops threw open the concentration camps and the photographs came back across the ocean. The mood in America turned hard and cold. The Geneva protections were already winding down as the war in Europe ended, so the army cut the prisoners' rations, shut down the canteen food sales, and pushed the work details harder. The comfort that had defined the early camps drained away in a matter of weeks. Through all of it, one fact kept nagging at the men who ran the system. These were enemy soldiers, living in the open country of a nation at war, watched over by fences a determined man could climb in under a minute. Almost none of them ever climbed. Out of some 372,000 German prisoners spread across the country, only about 2,222 ever tried to escape, about half of 1%, and nearly every one of them was back behind the wire within days. Even a prisoner who did slip past the fence found himself standing in the middle of Texas or Kansas or Arizona, 1,000 miles in every direction from anything that could help him. He had no papers, no money that spent outside the canteen, and the moment he opened his mouth, his accent turned him in. Most of the so-called escapes were really just short walks, a man slipping off for a day or two before hunger and boredom drove him back. Running didn't lead home. It led into a desert or a cornfield, with an ocean and a whole war still standing between him and Germany. But 2 days before Christmas, 1944, 25 men decided to test the odds. That night, 25 German prisoners crawl out through a tunnel they had dug beneath Camp Papago Park near Phoenix, the largest escape of Axis prisoners from any American camp in the entire war. The leader of the breakout is a U-boat captain named Jürgen Wattenberg, former commander of U-162, who has been plotting it for months. Some of the men have gone further still. They have built a boat in pieces and smuggled it out through the tunnel, and the plan, drawn from a map, is to float down the Salt River and on toward Mexico. The map leaves out one detail. The Salt River, for most of the year, is barely wet. The would-be sailors haul their boat to the riverbank, ready to launch, and find a channel of sand and gravel with a thin trickle running down the middle of it. There is no river to sail. One by one, over the following weeks, the escapees are rounded up cold and hungry and walked back into the camp. No one fires a shot. No one comes close to Mexico. Wattenberg himself is the last man taken, 5 weeks out, living in a desert cave north of Phoenix, before he is finally run to ground at the end of January. Texas told the same story in miniature. Across all of its camps, the records show only about 21 prisoners ever escaped, and every single one of them was caught within 3 weeks, most of them far sooner than that. Sheriffs, the FBI, and ordinary farmers all kept an eye out, and a stranger with a heavy accent stood out fast in a small town. The whole continent was the cage. Yet the deadliest danger inside these camps wasn't the guards or the desert. It was waiting in the next bunk over. The army made one early mistake that turned some camps into something closer to a battlefield. When the prisoners first arrived, nobody sorted them out. The committed Nazi, the teenage conscript who had never believed a word of it, and the quiet anti-Nazi who hated Hitler all went into the same compound behind the same fence, and they were left to settle the pecking order among themselves. The hardliners settled it with fear. In camp after camp, fanatical Nazis set up secret tribunals the prisoners called courts of honor, and they used them to police everyone else behind the wire. A man who spoke against Hitler, got too friendly with the American guards, or simply seemed to be enjoying the soft life a little too much, could be dragged in front of them in the dark. The punishments ran from a beating all the way up to something far worse, and the guards outside often had no idea what was being decided a few barracks away. Between September of 1943 and April of 1944, in camps scattered across the country, the government counted 6 murders, 2 forced suicides, and 43 so-called voluntary suicides, along with a full camp riot and hundreds of smaller assaults. That polite phrase, voluntary suicide, often meant a man was handed a rope and told what was expected of him. Some of the dead had been beaten to death by their own countrymen for the crime of no longer believing. The war they thought they had left behind in Europe had followed them across the ocean and right into the barracks. The killings are in the government's own files. At Camp Clinton in Mississippi, the hardliners murdered a German prisoner for what they called a lack of loyalty. At Camp Hearn in Texas, a prisoner named Hugo Kraus was beaten to death by his own bunkmates. Kraus had grown up in New York City, spoke English without an accent, and had been conscripted into the German army after returning to Germany before the war. To the true believers in the barracks, that made him something worse than an American. It made him a traitor. In a place with nowhere to hide, a whispered accusation could turn deadly overnight. The Werner Drexler case at Camp Papago Park cut even closer to the bone. Drexler was a U-boat sailor who had cooperated with American interrogators after his capture, giving up information, speaking freely about German naval operations. When he was transferred into the general prison population at Papago Park, word of what he had done arrived with him. 7 prisoners murdered him the night he walked through the gate. That killing, and others like it, were what the army had failed to prevent by mixing the fanatics in with everyone else. The army caught on, slowly, and began pulling the hardest Nazis out and shipping them to camps of their own, trying to separate the true believers from the men they preyed on. It helped, but it came late for the ones already in the ground. And when the fighting finally stopped, the United States didn't let the killings slide. The army put the worst of the murderers on trial, and in the summer of 1945, at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, it hanged 14 German prisoners, among them the 7 men who had killed Werner Drexler at Papago Park. Their crime wasn't fighting against America, it was murdering other Germans at camps in Oklahoma, Arizona, and South Carolina, for the sin of turning away from the party. For the ordinary prisoner, the math was brutal and simple. The most dangerous man in the whole camp spoke his own language and slept a few feet from his cot. The strangest contradiction of the entire program happened in the towns just outside the wire, in the diners and depots of the segregated South, and it cut deeper than anything the fences ever held in. At a small railroad depot in the wartime South, Corporal Rupert Trimmingham watched German prisoners get marched in for a meal and sit right down at the tables in the whites-only dining room. They were served hot food, and they talked and smoked and took their time over the plates, having, in his words, quite a swell time, while Trimmingham and the black soldiers guarding them were sent around back to eat in the kitchen. He wrote about it afterward in a letter to Yank, the Army's own magazine. It happened again and again across the South. German prisoners were served in whites-only cafeterias, waited on by black porters and cooks, and rolled through southern towns in Pullman cars with more comfort and more freedom than the black soldiers assigned to guard them. For those soldiers, the message was impossible to miss. They were handed a rifle and ordered to guard the enemies of the United States, then told they could not sit at the same counter as those enemies because of the color of their skin. Black troops had gone to war under a banner they called the Double V. One victory over fascism overseas and a second victory over racism at home. And scenes like the one at that depot showed exactly how far off the second victory still was. That contradiction didn't stay quiet, and it became part of the case that black veterans carried into the post-war years, until President Truman signed the order ending military segregation in 1948. The men behind the wire noticed it too. Some of the German prisoners wrote later that they had been stunned by what they saw of the way America treated its own citizens, and that the country guarding them was fighting for ideals it hadn't yet reached inside its own borders. What these men would carry home from all of this, the good and the ugly, was the last question left, and near the end of the war, the army decided it couldn't leave the answer to chance. If hundreds of thousands of them were going home to rebuild Germany, someone in Washington reasoned, then the years in American custody were a chance to send them back carrying different ideas than the ones they had shown up with. The Special Projects Division gathered up about 85 prisoners carefully vetted as genuine anti-Nazis, former editors, professors, writers and translators who had never been soldiers at heart. The army set them up at a quiet post called Fort Kearny in Rhode Island. There, behind their own fence, these prisoners went to work on the minds of their countrymen. They wrote and edited books, reviewed films, and produced a German-language newspaper called Der Ruf, The Call, and shipped it out to camps across the country, a circulation of some 75,000 copies. The plan was to slip democracy in through the reading material, one article at a time. The men who ran it nicknamed the operation the Idea Factory, and they kept it quiet, because leaning on prisoners to change their politics brushed right up against the same Geneva Convention the whole system stood on. It's fair to doubt whether it worked. A newspaper handed out through the same barbed wire that had held a man for years was never going to erase what he already believed. But the experiment mattered less for the prisoners it reached than for the writers it gathered. Der Ruf didn't die when the camps closed. A few of its writers, men like Alfred Andersch and Hans Werner Richter, went on to help found Gruppe 47, a circle that shaped German literature for the next 20 years. Going home turned out to be slower and harder than any of them expected. When the camps in America finally emptied out through 1946, most of the prisoners weren't put on a boat straight to Germany. They were shipped first to Britain and France, where they spent months, and sometimes years, doing more labor to help rebuild the countries their own army had wrecked. Only then did they reach home, and home was rubble, hunger, and foreign occupation. That's where the story usually stops. It leaves out what some of these men chose to do years later, and that part loops back to the trains where it all began. Not every man who left went quietly. Georg Gärtner, a German prisoner held at a camp in New Mexico, slipped out in 1945, weeks after the war ended, and simply disappeared. He built a new life in the American West under a borrowed name, working as a tennis coach and ski instructor, and lived that way for 40 years, until 1985, when he told his story on national television and gave himself up. He was the last German prisoner of the war to surrender, and by then, nobody wanted to punish him. America simply let him stay. Many of the others remembered America not as a prison at all, but as the place where they had been fed, paid, and treated like human beings while the rest of the world burned. They remembered the towns, the fields, and the farm families they had worked beside. Some of those bonds lasted. Prisoners had spent whole seasons working the same land as American farmers, sharing meals at the edge of a cotton field, learning a few words of each other's language. Letters crossed the Atlantic for years after the fences came down, and here and there, a former prisoner and an old guard or a farm family stayed in touch for the rest of their lives. For men going back to a flattened country, those memories of Texas and Alabama and Kansas were a picture of a place that had somehow stayed whole. And some of them did more than remember. After going home to the wreckage, former prisoners applied to come back to the United States as immigrants and became citizens of the country that had once held them behind wire. One of them, Heino Eriksson, had picked cotton as a prisoner at Camp Hearn, Texas. He went home to a flattened keel, came back to Texas in 1953, and 5 years later he raised his hand and became an American citizen. The same ocean that carried these men west under armed guard carried some of them back again by choice. The enemy came to America in chains and left as free men, and a few of them looked at the place and decided it was worth returning to for good. The wire never held them. The country did. Subscribe if this one was worth your time.